Good evening and welcome to the Back Porch Review. My name is Nick. What I'm going to do tonight is do a brief review of Bernard Cornwell's The Archer's Tale. I mentioned this book a few weeks ago in my video, well a couple weeks ago in my video of one that I read through the month of June. Really enjoyed it, and so what I thought I would do is kind of tell you guys about it, tell you my thoughts, what I thought about it, and give you a brief plot synopsis, and then just hear from you. So for everybody, before any kind of spoilery review, I thought I would read the back of the book and let you know at least what it's about, and if you're interested at all, then obviously you can pause the video and come back later after you've read it. But this is the first book in a trilogy called the Grail Quest Trilogy, which kind of hints as to what they're getting at some point. But the back of the book reads, a brutal raid on the quiet coastal village of Hookton in 1342 leaves but one survivor, a young archer named Thomas. On this terrible dawn, his purpose becomes clear: to recover a stolen relic and pursue to the ends of the earth the murderous black-clad knight bearing a blue and yellow standard, a journey that leads him to the courageous rescue of a beautiful French woman and sets him on his ultimate quest, the search for the Holy Grail. Again, before I get into a more spoilery review, if that sounds interesting to you at all, then I would highly recommend you pause the video because I'm going to get a little spoilery. But before you do, this is the same author that wrote the Sharps series, so like Sharps Rifle, Sharps Tigers, things like that. They were actually made into TV movies starring Sean Bean. I've not seen the movies, but I've read some of the Sharps books, and they're really good. So if you've heard of those and this author appeals to you, then again, I would highly recommend checking this out. But if you don't want a spoiler yet, then obviously stop the video and come back later and let me know your thoughts. For those that are going to hang out, just a quick rundown. I don't want to get through, obviously, all the details because I want to give you a chance to read it if you're interested. But the short of it is, this story begins on Easter Sunday, Easter morning at dawn on 1342. What we find out is that there's this tiny little village named Hookton that has this pretty well-known relic that just seemed to have disappeared, and it's the lance of St. George. And if you know the story of St. George, you know that St. George supposedly killed a dragon with this lance. The village priest there, turns out, was Thomas's father, actual father, not just his spiritual father, but his actual father. And he is murdered by this black-clad knight. And Thomas vows to him as he is dying that he will get the lance back and bring it back to England. And then as the introduction ends, because that's all part of the introduction, Thomas kills quite a few of the raiders that come along with this knight from France that have come across the channel. And then he flees to a larger village and joins with King Edward III's army, and he is marched off to what is the beginning of the 100 Years' War. The book then picks up the next chapter about 3 years later, as Thomas is with a band of archers and the Earl of Northampton's army laying siege to a small city named La Roche-de-Rennes. My French is very poor. I should have asked my wife before I made this video, since she minored in French, but I'll pronounce it the best I can, and we will just hope that I don't offend anybody. But as they're laying siege to this village, this beautiful French woman is actually coming up on the walls of this village and shooting out arrows with her crossbow at the English army as they're trying to get into the village. She kills quite a few of them. They began to refer to her as the Blackbird, which we later find out her name is Jeanette. But once the Earl's army actually takes La Roche-de-Rennes, they obviously occupy it, and Jeanette is really kind of laid upon by this knight that's part of the Earl of Northampton's army. His name is Sir Simon. Sir Simon does not exemplify what you would expect of a knight. He's very poor, partly because his father died and left his family impoverished, and so Sir Simon is obviously trying to regain some wealth by taking these cities, stealing money, and Jeanette has the armor of her dead husband, who was a knight in the French army, and so obviously that'll bring in a pretty penny and things like this. So what you find out is Sir Simon is really trying to claim Jeanette and her possessions as his own. Thomas, our archer friend, protects her, and he feels compelled to protect her because he hates this knight just as much as everybody else does, and definitely as much as Jeanette does. And so he hatches a plan with her to try and kill Sir Simon. In that assassination attempt, Thomas accidentally shoots Sir Simon's squire, and therefore is obviously charged with murder and is going to be hanged. So Thomas and Jeanette flee for their lives. Over the course of a couple chapters, but they obviously get to know each other well, they fall in love, things like this. But they stumble back upon the English army. Obviously Sir Simon isn't happy, but the Earl of Northampton knows a good archer when he sees one, and he pays off Thomas's debt. Basically just gives Sir Simon some bribe money to leave him alone. As the book goes on, what happens is the English army lays siege to a city known as Caen, I believe, maybe Caen, but I believe it's Caen. And these are all historical events that happened. You can look these up for sure. But over the course of this, what happens is Thomas ends up stumbling upon a knight that was part of the original siege, or the original raid on his village at the beginning of the book. He saves this knight's daughter from being raped and pillaged and things like this, because this is the 1300s. I mean, these things happen in warfare. And he takes her, and they go off with the English army to obviously fight the larger French force. The book ends with this major epic battle. The English army are underfed, they're underclothed, and they hold them off, mostly with English longbows, which if you know anything about warfare during this time period, you know that the English longbows definitely won the day during this time period, because before, you know, firearms were part of normal warfare. Because they gave the English an advantage beyond anything else, partly because of their range, and they were just deadly. These archers were good killing machines. But Thomas comes across this knight, saves his daughter, and then actually in the French army, this black-clad knight that led the raid charges forward to try and take the day. Thomas gets the lance back, but in the course of all this, he ends up on a quest for the Holy Grail, and there's a lot of details about this French knight that we find out how he's connected to a lot of relics, one of them being the Holy Grail, and the story continues obviously in the next two books. I believe the second is called Vagabond, the third is called Heretic, and it's a really compelling story. The characters are very well written, but it's violent. If you are easily offended by any kind of violence, like if Game of Thrones bothers you, then you don't need to read this book. Warfare during the Middle Ages was not pretty. It was not full of chivalry and glamour. When these men of the clay, of the common clay of the American West kind of thing, if you've watched any Mel Brooks, these common men, when they took a city or a village, they were allowed the spoils of war. That was stealing, killing, murdering, raping, things kind of things. So this stuff is in here. The language in it can be rough. So if these kind of details bother you, then obviously don't read the book. But if they don't, or at least they should bother you. They bother me, because these things were obviously horrendous. But for the sake of the historicity of the story, it's important and it's compelling. Bernard Cornwell is a historian at heart. He researches his subjects before he writes this. He takes only a few liberties, mainly with the main character Thomas. I don't believe he existed, but this Earl of Northampton existed. These cities that were laid siege by the English army in France existed. This battle at the end of the book, it existed, it happened. The English won the day. But Bernard Cornwell is very much writes wonderful historical fiction. So if you want to know more about the history of the time period, he actually in the back of this one gives you some of the resources he used for his research to write this novel. But in regards to the time period itself and just the day-to-day kind of thing, he just writes a very compelling narrative, and I'm excited and I'm interested to read the other two books in the series. So again, that is The Archer's Tale by Bernard Cornwell. Highly recommended. Set in the 100 Years' War in the 1340s. Follows an archer named Thomas, and like I said in the back, it's on the quest for the Holy Grail. It's warfare, men being men, beautiful women, these kind of things, and totally worth your time if you're interested at all in any kind of good historical fiction. So that'll do it for this review. I'd say I'd give it, I gave it, I believe, 4 stars out of 5 on Goodreads, mostly because of the historical side of it, being a history buff myself, holding a history degree. Totally worth your time. But again, that's it for tonight. The Archer's Tale by Bernard Cornwell, and come back again next time and we will hopefully have another interesting book to check out. Until next time, this is Nick from the Back Porch Review.